bring my daughter Karmein back to home because all my family love her very much. Karmein, this is your favorite dress. You have to come home and wear it. Come back and dress it. Please, release my daughter. Oh, my family love her. Don't spoil my family, please.
It was the crime that traumatised Melbourne.
He's woken up with nightmares. What if someone comes in, Mum?
13-year-old Karmein Chan kidnapped by a predator.
You can't even think about it in your worst nightmares.
They called him Mr. Cruel.
Some describe him as a monster, and I think that's probably accurate.
How many young girls has he preyed on?
Lock up the doors, keep the children inside and trust no one.
But was Mr. Cruel also a killer?
I think that he probably said, I can't release this one.
Adam Shan dives deep into the pool of evidence.
The fear and paranoia was elevated by an horrific truth.
And discovers shocking revelations for Australia's most baffling cold case.
There were perhaps a dozen victims.
I'm outside the house in Melbourne's eastern suburbs where Karmein Chan lived with her family and where she was abducted in 1991. I was working in Melbourne at the time, but had no children yet. It was a much quieter, more genteel town back then. There had been abductions before, but this offender seemed so calculating and cool. No family was safe. I'll never forget Phyllis Chan's heart-rending press conference. She could have been any mother in Melbourne, and Karmein, anyone's child. The city I'd moved to 2 years prior was changing before my eyes. The darkness had never held such terror before.
Big manhunt is underway in Melbourne tonight following the abduction at knife point of a schoolgirl.
The abduction took place around 9 o'clock last night. 13-year-old Karmein Chan was babysitting her two younger sisters, aged 9 and 7, while her parents were at work in the family restaurant.
These were very, very ordinary people. In the space of 5 minutes, that was obliterated. When Karmein was abducted, I had a daughter of a similar age, and I kept my feet on the ground because I was doing what I was doing for all the girls out there, certainly, but particularly to protect my own daughter.
Chris, let's talk about the Karmein Chan abduction and the crime scene. It seems that whoever took Karmein had been looking at the house for some time beforehand.
I think that's a fair assumption.
The three Chan sisters were at home watching TV.
Yes.
And the person enters the house. What can we piece together from what Karmein's sisters were able to tell police about the intruder?
The offender was wearing a balaclava or headgear of some description. He was armed with a knife.
And what did he tell the girls?
He confronted Karmein and her sisters in the hallway and grabbed them and dragged them back into the bedroom and instructed the two young ones to go into the cupboard. He secured the cupboard door and left with Karmein.
Karmein disappears. My involvement started with a phone call, a visit to the scene, speaking to Karmein's sister, her mother, and spending some time with them. In front of you, you can see individuals who are crumbling because their child, their sister, is gone, and no one can give them an answer.
What do you say to someone where you don't have an answer?
All you can do is provide a connection, be there when they want to see you, to talk to you, and never hold out false hope that it is going to work out.
Advance size, mud, clay, water.
A massive police manhunt got underway on the streets of Melbourne. Police began door knocking, but they had few leads to go on, except for a blunt, spray-painted message left behind by the abductor.
The family Toyota parked at the front of the house had been daubed with slogans saying "Payback, more to come," and a reference to Asian drug money. The Chans run a Chinese restaurant in Bulleen and a takeaway outlet at Lower Plenty. Mr. Chan has been unable to provide police with a motive for the abduction or the graffiti on the car.
Is he known to police in any way at all?
Mr. Chan is not, no. He's a very well-respected man in the community.
My wife with me, and I'm very hard to sleep.
We couldn't sleep.
It's every parent's worst nightmare that some man in a balaclava with a gun and a knife is going to breach the sanctity of your home and take one of your children. I was a Melburnian living here as a parent, and I just thought, look, I want to get to the bottom of this. I want to help catch this bloke. He almost certainly watched that awful press conference with Phyllis.
It's been 3 days since their oldest daughter, Karmein, was abducted at knife point from their Templestowe home.
Police and Phyllis Chan were hoping that he just had this much amount of human decency and that he would watch that and think, yes, I'll release her.
Please, release my daughter!
Reporters can be accused of being a hard-hearted lot, but I think that kind of a press conference would have an effect on people, not just as reporters, but as people living in Melbourne.
Oh, yes, I'm a father of four myself. I reckon any parent that lived through that period will tell you that they probably changed the way what they let their children do.
I don't go out anywhere unless she comes with me. She doesn't even go to babysitters or anything. She's always with us.
He's woken up with nightmares. You know, what if someone comes in, Mum, and it's terrible. It's terrible for a 5-year-old to have to think like that.
Parents changed their behaviours, children changed their behaviours, parents and children became fearful. No guarantees could be given. This man was still out there. It was quite a dramatic thing. There were reports of children, nightmares, parents sleeping in the children's bedrooms, turning the houses into fortresses. And one of the interesting things that follows is that those young children are now young parents. And I know, perhaps because I was involved in the case, many of these people are repeating that behaviour now.
The abduction of Karmein Chan was a seismic event for families in Melbourne. The fear and paranoia they were feeling was elevated by an horrific truth. This had happened before. Other young girls had been preyed upon. Many, including the police, believe the man responsible for kidnapping Karmein Chan had also taken other children in Melbourne's eastern suburbs, including Sharon Wills and Nikki Linus. The abductor was now being called Mr. Cruel, and he was the most wanted man in Australia.
Next, when did Mr. Cruel's reign of terror begin?
John Wills wakes up with a gun to his head and Mr. Cruel's saying, you're not going to do anything stupid, or you're not going to be a hero.
Melbourne in 1991 was a city on edge following the abduction of Karmein Chan. Many believed a predator dubbed Mr. Cruel had struck again. We found evidence that Mr. Cruel was connected to up to 12 assaults. Let's go to August 1987, when he attacked an 11-year-old girl in Melbourne's eastern suburb of Lower Plenty. Her identity's never been disclosed, but how much can you say about the case?
Well, there are a number of close similarities to some of the other cases. Again, the early hours of the morning, this offender has broken in through a front window. He's disturbed the parents who were asleep in bed. Once the parents were restrained, he went to the children's bedroom, and there were two children in there. One was the victim and one was her sibling. The sibling was harnessed to the bed, and the 11-year-old was taken out of the bedroom to the bathroom. At the completion of the assault, he ate some food, had some drink. He stole a quantity of money and some jewellery and clothing from the family, and he left via the front door.
He's there on the scene for some time.
Yes.
And so the more he's there, the more traces of his presence he has to remove. You wonder whether this might have led him on the next occasion to escalate his behaviour and take his victim away from the scene to minimise the clean-up, I'd imagine.
That may have inspired that behaviour.
16 months later, in December 1988, Mr. Cruel struck again. This time in Ringwood, another eastern suburb of Melbourne. He targeted 10-year-old Sharon Wills, one of 4 daughters born to Julie and John Wills.
This is a photo of the Wills girls with their mother Julie, taken in 1988. It was for a story in the Sun newspaper 6 months before 10-year-old Sharon was abducted. It told of how Julie Wills saved Sharon from a burning bed. Police believe the offender read the article and learnt that all 4 sisters slept in bunk beds in one room. This was critical information for a dangerous predator who was about to escalate his behaviour.
Mr. Cruel breaks in. Everybody's asleep in the house. John Wills wakes up with a gun to his head, and Mr. Cruel's saying, "You're not going to do anything stupid, are you? You're not going to be a hero." So they were tied up. He then goes into the room and takes Sharon.
It's at this point the offender changes his behaviour. Instead of taking Sharon to the bathroom and assaulting her, he kidnaps her and takes her for a long drive to a house somewhere in the suburbs, maybe even his own home. One can only imagine the terror that Sharon endured.
Detectives said the man, armed with a pistol and wearing a dark-coloured balaclava, was intent on capturing the child and had possibly loitered in the area for several days before raiding the Hillcrest Avenue house yesterday morning.
So how were the parents at that moment?
You can't even think about it in your worst nightmares. Yet here it was, it had happened to them.
And what was their fear?
What was happening to their daughter? This terrible sense that they may not see her again.
We're dealing with a very cunning person, a person who we regard as very dangerous and an unknown potential. Some describe him as a monster, and I think that's probably accurate.
Remember, this was before the widespread use of CCTV. In 1988, police had none of the technology we take for granted today. They scoured the streets, they door-knocked, they stopped and searched cars, they set up a police van for the public to feed information into. Everything they could do to find little Sharon. And then, after 18 tense hours, a stunning breakthrough.
About midnight, a woman motorist spotted Sharon wearing a man's white shirt walking along Orchard Road, Bayswater, soon after she'd been dumped from a car. With a policeman's jacket around her shoulders, the girl was taken to the Austin Hospital for a medical check. This morning, she was brought home, cuddling a teddy bear and in the arms of her father. Police said Sharon had been assaulted, gagged and kept blindfolded throughout the ordeal. An emotional Mr. Wills was grateful to all who assisted in the search for his daughter.
I'd just like to thank all my friends, my neighbours, my relatives. I'd like to thank the media for your coverage and your assistance to get my daughter back. And most of all, I'd like to thank the lovely lady in Bayswater. Thank you.
Sharon's release was a remarkable outcome that few had expected. While the Wills family tried to put their lives back together, brave Sharon was extremely helpful to the police, telling them as much as she could about the man who'd taken her. She'd never seen him. Her blindfold was on for the whole 18 hours. And yet, one time when he left her alone in his bedroom, she snuck a look.
In Sharon Wills's case, she was able to very bravely take the blindfold off for a second, and scarily, the thing that was at the end of the bed was a video camera. So he's obviously been recording what he's been doing.
Sharon was able to describe the bedroom plan of the detention house.
That description of the bedroom was drawn by one of the victims to her extreme danger, had a peep, even though she was warned against that.
When he wasn't assaulting her, Sharon's abductor was calm and courteous. And when he made the decision to release her in the grounds of Bayswater High School, it was done in a careful, calculating way, as Professor David Wells discovered during a medical examination.
This individual, on the victim's description, went to great lengths to clean them or remove potentially damaging forensic evidence.
The girl was placed in a green garbage bag, stood in the bag, and it was taped around her shoulders. Another garbage bag was put over her head and taped around her body. She still had a blindfold, the tape over her eyes.
Here is someone who perhaps knows a little bit about forensic principles or procedures. He was calculating, prepared, and had made a lot of arrangements to reduce the likelihood of him being caught.
Julie, what would you like to say to somebody who might be watching now who may know this man?
Someone must know him. He couldn't be that much of a loner. Someone, either he's married, got a girlfriend, he's got a mother somewhere, surely, who must have some idea. He needs help before he takes another little girl.
Coming up, Mr. Cruel strikes again, but will he release his victim this time?
The master-armed abductor grabbed Nicola Linus from her parents' home over 18 hours ago.
This is not looking good.
This is National 9 News.
Good evening. A ransom demand has been made for the return of a 13-year-old schoolgirl kidnapped in Canterbury. The master-armed abductor grabbed Nicola Linus from her parents' home over 18 hours ago. Police say the man forced a window at the back of the Linus home in exclusive Monomeath Avenue just before midnight. 13-year-old Nicola and her 15-year-old sister were asleep in a bedroom. Their parents were out at a dinner party at the time.
Aside from the fact her parents were not at home, the abduction of Nicola Linus was very similar to the Sharon Wills case. Mr. Cruel probably staked out the house for days beforehand. He forced entry to the property, but before leaving with the victim, intriguingly, he stole a number of items, which leads us to a very interesting theory.
It's my view, for what it's worth, 27 years of policing and 25 years as a psychologist, that this man is a burglar who's become opportunistic. He plans his operations carefully. He selects houses, selects families. He excludes houses with dogs. And if you look at the information about missing LPs and money going missing, raiding the fridge, that to me has more hallmarks of a burglar who's become more specialised in his taste rather than someone else who is a defender who's now acquired the attributes and skills of an expert burglar. His own ego drives this as an operation. The control is part of that operation. That's why he's meticulous. That's why he takes his time. And that's why eventually he moved into an idea of, if I take the girls off-site, I can control the off-site location. And that's what happened.
Sharon Wills was released after 18 hours of captivity. In the case of Nicola Linus, there was still no breakthrough after twice that long.
Good evening, and the father of the 13-year-old kidnapped Canterbury girl pleads for her safety. Brian Linus says he will do anything to have his teenage daughter released.
Brian Linus should have been preparing today for his daughter's 14th birthday. Instead, he was appealing for her safe return.
We'd just very much like to have Nikki back with us, obviously. Can't wait to have her back with us.
Nicola Linus has now been missing for 42 hours. 20 detectives are now working on the case.
Did you think she'd be found?
I hoped.
So what happened next?
I think it was about in the early hours of the morning, my phone rang. And it was the old D24, the call-out service from police. And a very excited inspector on the phone saying, "We've found her. We've got her."
Still bound and blindfolded, Nikki was bundled out of a car into the darkness of a quiet street, just kilometres from the family home.
Nikki, I think, had been found on the street. She was taken to the Austin Hospital, and I went straight there.
Because the tendency right then and there would be for the parent to want to grab their child and hold them. But there are important procedures that have to be followed. What happened then?
I spent 2 or 3 hours with Nikki, with the assistance of a nurse. She was a strong girl, but having said that, you're aware that this is a very foreign situation. She's had some unspeakable events occur. Now some total stranger is sitting in front of her, asking her to talk about those events, and outside of her parents. And I remember one of the most emotional moments was when I'd concluded this examination, to be able to walk out and say to the parents, physically, she's in good shape. And now it's your turn. Nikki appears. The emotion in that room, everyone was crying. Everyone. Even the hardened detectives. It was a moment you never forget.
Yesterday, detectives scoured the Kew area where Nicole was dumped early on the morning of her 14th birthday.
As with previous victims, Mr. Krul had done his homework, leaving virtually no trace of evidence for investigators to work with. But Nicola was able to help in narrowing down the search for the house she was detained in.
Nikki Linus was able to give us some good information in relation to the noises, sounds she heard, and one of those sounds related to aircraft. The information she gave us allowed sufficiently for them to identify one runway at Melbourne Airport whose flight path went over these certain suburbs. When I say certain suburbs, I'm saying anywhere from Craigieburn through to Strathmore. That's a lot of houses.
So that's about as much as investigators knew or were prepared to release to the media about the abduction of Nicola Linus. 9 months later, Karmein Chan was taken. In both cases, the girl's parents were not at home. They were both abducted during school holidays, and they both attended the same private school.
I think Nicola's own reaction was such a positive one. She did not let it overcome her. She was ready to meet with her friends immediately after and to share their friendship and support. She showed great courage, and I'm sure that Karmein will do the same.
Karmein, your school friends keep ringing you. They love you to come back with them, you know.
My wife with me, and I'm very hard to sleep.
We couldn't sleep.
So we hope that the men understand and release her as soon as possible, so we can have a family together.
The days go by. There's no ransom note,
There's no nothing. At what point do you start to lose hope that there won't be a repeat of Nicky Linus's return?
You have to hold hope. You have to, because the alternative doesn't bear thinking about. But you've also got to be realistic with a parent and a sibling that this is not looking good.
A man walking his dogs through this industrial desert in Melbourne's north stumbled across a skull on Thursday evening. It had several bullet wounds in the side. After further investigations, police recovered the rest of the body, and although they're yet to establish an identity, they're confident they know who it is.
Whilst we don't have any positive information at this point in time, it is quite a possibility that it is in fact Karmein.
It was almost a year to the day since she'd been abducted. Forensics fairly quickly confirmed that, yes, indeed, it was the body of Karmein.
A devastated Phyllis Chan held a traditional Buddhist ceremony with her two daughters in the Thomastown wasteland where Karmein was found, offering food and flowers and praying for her soul.
Terrible sadness at a whole range of levels that now that she's gone forever. And the knowledge that the individual involved in this case, perhaps all of the cases, was prepared to escalate his activities to that point.
The execution-style murder of Karmein Chan indeed was a massive escalation, but it also raised new questions for task force investigators. Was Karmein abducted and killed by Mr. Cruel, or could it have been someone else with a different motive? What does 3 bullets in the head tell you about the offender or the nature of the offence?
I suspect this was a message being sent. This was a child, a daughter of a family member, and this was about the link between the father and the offender. Karmein Chan was simply just the vehicle used to make the point.
Graffiti sprayed on the Chan's family car on the night of Karmein's disappearance has raised speculation about a vendetta against the family, which owns 2 restaurants.
I knew Phyllis Chan before the abduction. I knew her afterwards. I live in Eltham and dined at her restaurant a number of times. I don't for one moment think she was involved in any way in drugs.
What about John Chan, her husband?
I don't know so much about John, and he took off fairly quickly after the killing of Karmein, so I really don't know enough about John.
Victoria Police established Task Force Spectrum as soon as Karmein Chan was abducted. It was a multifaceted investigation because of all the similarities to the earlier abductions. But I've been told by a couple of former Spectrum members that in their opinion, the underworld drug connection was not chased hard enough.
What you need to know is that there were several crews involved in that investigation, and each of the crews had different responsibilities. My crew had the responsibility of putting together the brief of evidence and interviewing the suspect if we located him. There were members sent throughout the world conducting investigations, and advice was sought from police forces throughout the world. Other crews had the responsibility for looking at the drug involvement, and to my knowledge, that avenue of inquiry was exhausted as far as we could have at the time.
But not excluded?
No, it's not been excluded to this day.
I swear I do nothing wrong. And I've been here 15 years, always in business. I start 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning and finish at midnight. So I work hard, I know a good opportunity to Australia.
There was no evidence to connect John Chan with the disappearance of his daughter, so police turned their attention back to the prime suspect.
The reason the police kept coming back to Mr. Cruel was because he had a history of laying false trails. Remember the $25,000 ransom demand made with Nikki Linus? It came to nothing because she was released without any further demands being made. And that was not the only false trail laid by Mr. Cruel.
In one of the houses, he picked up the telephone and pretended to talk to somebody. And he did it in front of the victim, when in actual fact the police were able to show that he'd actually cut the line beforehand and he wasn't talking to anybody. The spray painting of the car was another tactic to try and divert them away, to make them think that isn't connected to the others. This is obviously an attack because of something the father did.
The abduction of Karmein Chan prompted a massive response from the public. Anyone who had a suspicion about their neighbour or someone they knew was calling into Task Force Spectrum. Every single piece of information had to be followed up and scrutinised. Such was the pressure to find Mr. Cruel and stop him re-offending.
We received somewhere in the vicinity of 10, 11,000 individual information sheets that had to be physically investigated by a detective. We physically inspected over 30,000 houses trying to seek out the detention premises. We sent a letter to all the doctors in Victoria seeking any information in relation to any clients they may have. And that's the other issue that perhaps highlighted it into its infamy, was that there was potentially several victims, many more than what we knew of at the time.
How many do you put together as being part of this investigation?
Broadly speaking, perhaps a dozen. And therein lies the challenge from a community perspective. If it's promoted as the bogeyman, then the response is going to be lock up the doors, keep the children inside and trust no one.
The police were working around the clock, chasing up any and every lead that might have led to Mr. Cruel. If he was responsible for the abduction of Karmein Chan, the question the police had to answer was why did he not release her as he had Nicola Linus and Sharon Wills? Why did he feel the need to murder her?
We have no idea. There are plenty of theories, but there is no evidence that points us in any one direction.
Next, we reveal the prime suspect.
Just a few questions about the Mr. Cruel investigation. No, I don't want to talk to you.
They found a balaclava and a knife in his attic. Mr. Cruel, of course, wore a balaclava and used a knife.
To this day, Victoria Police is still unclear why Karmein was killed by her abductor. One thing they know for sure is that Mr. Cruel went to incredible lengths to keep his identity a secret.
Phyllis Chan said that Karmein was a very feisty 13-year-old and she would not have gone quietly. And what the police and she suspect is Karmein maybe whipped his balaclava off or pulled hers off and saw his face. Once she'd seen Mr. Cruel's face, I think that he probably said, I can't release this one.
If the killer is unmasked, he may well indeed be forced into killing the victim.
Absolutely. I fully agree with that. And that's another reason why the Karmein Chan case has not been excluded from the others.
As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Cruel could be connected to up to 12 assaults. I've spoken at length to his first documented victim from 1985. Understandably, she doesn't want to talk on camera, but she did relay what he said to her during the assault. My liberty, my freedom, is more important than your life. This is very telling when viewed through the lens of the Karmein Chan murder.
In the mid-1980s, DNA testing was in its infancy, and poor forensic work in the early cases dramatically impacted later investigations.
Quite a lot of the original exhibits and witness statements from 1985, 86, 87 that David Sprague desperately wanted were never able to be found. In one case, the victim, and I think it was his first victim, had been tied up, and the rope was retrieved, and the rope had been popped into a plastic bag. Whilst he got very good at covering his tracks, common sense suggests you don't start off that good. If he was ever going to make mistakes, it would have been in those early days. That rope could have had his DNA on it, and the Spectrum Task Force were mortified when they couldn't find the rope.
The 1985 survivor, in her statement, believes the assailant ejaculated in her, and swabs were taken. Do you think if they are around, they could still be tested?
They could certainly be matched if they're still in existence.
Good evening, Crime Stoppers.
The Mr. Cruel case was one of the first where Victoria Police tried to build a profile of the offender.
What we're dealing with here is a very disturbed individual who's certainly creating an atmosphere of terror in this town.
Tim Watson-Munro, a criminal psychologist, was brought in on the case before Sharon Wills was abducted.
He just strikes me as your textbook psychopath, somebody who plans a crime meticulously, no forensic evidence. So I think more likely he's an individual who had perversions floating around in his head, and it just went from there, and it escalated quite dramatically once he crossed the Rubicon and started breaking into places and then abducting children. And I predicted, sadly correctly, that the next one may well be killed.
I can't understand why you were taken. My pain at your going can never compare with the agony which you endured.
When Karmein Chan was abducted, police sought the help of the American FBI, which pioneered the idea of criminal profiling in the 1970s. This was the 3-page fax they sent through 11 days after Karmein was taken. It tallied with the view of investigators that Mr. Cruel was actually more like Mr. Average. He was aged from his 20s to his 50s, between 165 and 183 centimetres tall. His build was thin to medium with a small pot belly. He had no accent and was quietly spoken. This could have been any one of thousands of people.
The minute you start calling him Mr. Cruel, members of the public think he's a shady character with a dark overcoat that wanders out of X-rated shops carrying a bundle full of porn. In actual fact, he's probably a clean-living bloke who lives with his mum and puts the next-door neighbour's rubbish out on a Sunday, and the people around him might think he's a nice, normal bloke. At the end of a 3-year investigation, Operation Spectrum ended up with what they called the Sierra Files. So there was 7 suspects that had the propensity to commit this sort of crime and had committed similar crimes in the past, not quite as extreme, of which one of those suspects, a former Melbourne University lecturer, is, in the eyes of David Sprague, who was head of the task force, the prime suspect.
That man is Brian Enkler, and Channel 9's A Current Affair tracked him down.
Just a few questions about the Mr. Cruel investigation.
Go away, I don't want to talk to you.
He was jailed for 10 years in the 1970s after pleading guilty to tying up and attacking 6 girls at knife point over a 2-year period. You destroyed their lives.
So you say.
After Karmein Chan, they raided his house because he has priors for offences, went to jail for 10 years in the 70s for attacks on children. They found a balaclava and a knife in his attic. Mr. Cruel, of course, wore a balaclava and used a knife.
You do admit that you're the prime suspect, though?
Well, I know I am because they've told me.
He's the one that David Sprague is pretty sure did it, but there is no forensic evidence to speak of, no witnesses. He denies it. How are you going to prove it?
Despite Sprague's belief, there is no evidence that Enkler is Mr. Cruel. And many think he is not the prime suspect.
That was one of probably a good half a dozen that were of equal suspicion. There are a number of suspects that haven't been eliminated. Quite a few.
Next, Is Mr. Cruel still out there?
This is an active investigation.
It's been 28 years since Mr. Cruel abducted his last victim, Karmein Chan. No one's ever been charged, but the investigation remains open to this day. It's frustrating for police, but what's always baffled them is that Mr. Cruel's reign of terror came to an abrupt end after Karmein. Why?
It depends who you speak to in the task force. Certainly there are some who think, yeah, he must be dead, because that sort of offender, it's a compulsion, it's an addiction. They don't usually stop until they're caught. Dave Sprague's view is that he got such a fright that he had to do something he didn't want to do, which is kill one of his victims, that shocked him into not offending again.
It's very seductive. It's very consumer-orientated for the people who read the newspapers. It puts the bosses off the back, it mollifies the politicians, it answers all those what-if questions, this guy coming back. It doesn't make any sense. Good criminals, offenders, serial offenders, they don't get scared off. They believe, their ego believes they're better than the system, they're better than investigators.
My suspicion is that he probably just left town or he went to jail and died. There were the hillside stranglers in Los Angeles. A guy and his cousin were abducting, raping and murdering women in the Hills district of LA, dumping the cadavers on the front lawns of places as all part of the horror show. And it stopped as abruptly as it started. He was eventually discovered in Oregon. So he'd relocated, he'd gone further north and into a different state. And it started again. Back in the 80s, there were island states within Australia in many ways, so there wasn't any centralised data bank. There was no discussion between forces.
We devised a system called LEAP, which came into force about 3 months after I retired. New South Wales designed a system of a similar kind, but they couldn't talk to one another. And that was ludicrous. There should have been a universal system across the country so forces could share information of that kind. There would have been a much better opportunity to track repeat offenders who had just simply moved interstate. And I'm not sure to this day whether the various police systems can actually talk to one another.
Victoria Police never got their man, but this case jolted our justice system and forced change in the early 1990s. Our society was woefully ill-equipped to deal with offenders of any description, let alone one like Mr. Cruel. For instance, back then it was still not illegal to possess pornography in the state of Victoria. That's remarkable.
It's important that the community are aware that possession, manufacture, production of pornography became a specific crime on the statutes as a consequence of our presentation to the parliamentarians of the material we'd collected. Stalking, offender loitering in the vicinity of a school. Again, that came directly from the task force.
Task Force Spectrum arrested 75 child offenders. Their good work shamed governments into recognising that children needed protecting.
I still have adult women in their 40s coming to me saying, look, I was the same age as Karmein, and it chills me as much today as it did then. Now, that's 25 years down the track.
"25 years since the abduction and murder of Karmein Chan, police believe her killer is still alive. They're using the anniversary to offer a $1 million reward to find the man dubbed Mr. Cruel, who terrorised Melbourne schoolgirls.
Anniversary stories often prompt somebody to ring Crime Stoppers.
Over the years, 27,000 people have been interviewed over the crimes. 32 men are still considered possible suspects. The hope is someone who knows the answer feels safe enough now to come forward.
Every time I write a story about Mr. Cruel, I get letters and emails, all of which I pass on to the police. Most of them are people want to nominate their ex-husbands, ex-boyfriends, and look, I'm sure some of it's malicious, but you never want to ignore calls to Crime Stoppers or calls to journalists, because it just takes the right one and the crime can be solved. John, to this day, blames himself, and of course he shouldn't, but he blames himself because he says, Keith, I was the man of the house. It was my job to protect them.
Are you confident that you picked up all the physical evidence?
I hope so. I mean, we'll never know.
Chris, you retired without an answer. Do you think possibly the answer is actually already there in the file?
I think for any unsolved crime, the answer could always be in the file. This is an active investigation. These people have lived with this for, in some cases, over 30 years. You know? What can we do to ease their load? I know the Victoria Police is very, very keen to solve these crimes. The answer could be the next person you speak to.